Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thanks for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. Today we focus on early childhood education. Up front, Las Cruces Public Schools is one of 11 districts across the state that recently launched New Mexico Pre-K. It's a state-funded program for 4-year-olds. Other districts expanded the program. More from Mallory Falk.
It's the first day of pre-K at Jornada Elementary School, and there's a flurry of activity. Kids stack blocks precariously high, flip through picture books, and spoon-feed their baby dolls carrots and mashed potatoes.
Oh, that's mashed potatoes. Oh, that's mashed potatoes.
Jornada is one of 7 local schools that started offering New Mexico Pre-K this year. Evangeline Barella is principal here. When she got the call asking if her school would like to add a pre-K class, it was a no-brainer.
My first response was yes, and where do I sign?
Jornada already had a Head Start program which serves low-income students, and a program called DD Pre for students with developmental delays.
But we had parents asking, what about students that may not qualify for either one of those programs?
It's hard to find free or affordable pre-K seats in Doña Ana County, or really any form of early childhood education. Erica Srova is with the Center for Community Analysis at New Mexico State University.
We did an analysis last year and we found that only 36% of children under the age of 5 have access to free or subsidized high-quality early childhood education. For children that are 2 years old and younger, there's even less access.
Only about 21%. It's hard to compare Doña Ana County with the rest of the state or country because Srova and her team have really specific criteria for what qualifies as high quality. But she says those numbers are troubling.
Because we have a lot of children under the age of 5 that are living in poverty.
About 44%, which is higher than the state average.
And if we don't provide these opportunities for children to, we're setting them up for failure, really.
A ton of brain development happens before kids reach kindergarten. Srova says it's critical to reach children at an early age when their brain architecture is actually being built. She says waiting until age 5 is too late. You can start to see language gaps in children at around 18 months. Research has found that early childhood education can make a difference. In states like Oklahoma and North Carolina, students in preschool programs ended up with higher test scores, lower retention rates, and, in North Carolina at least, fewer special education placements. But that didn't hold true in Tennessee, where most positive effects of pre-K faded by 2nd or 3rd grade. Srova says that's not necessarily an argument against pre-K.
One of the problems with looking at that type of data is that you don't know what happened between K and 3 if the teachers aren't capitalizing on that progress that the children are coming in with.
And many researchers agree the quality of pre-K and other early childhood education programs matters. You can't just dump a bunch of children into an overcrowded classroom, sit them on the carpet all day, and lecture at them. The most effective classes have a low student-teacher ratio and an evidence-based curriculum that involves lots of learning through play. That's what's happening here at Jornada Elementary. Children cycle through different stations, each intended to build and test specific skills. Martha Benavides is the new pre-K teacher.
When you go into the classroom, it'll look like chaos, but it's very much planned out play. And I explained to the parents that, they're going to come home and say, we played, and they did, but there's a lot of learning going on through play.
Principal Evangeline Barella says the demand for this type of program is high. She capped the pre-K class at 16 students and says there's a waiting list. Varela hopes the district can offer even more seats next school year. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Mallory Falk.
Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno. Today we talk about child well-being in New Mexico. We also will discuss early childhood education and how that is being conducted in our area and in rural parts of the state. Joining us is Sylvia Ulloa from New Mexico In Depth. Sylvia, you've been covering this issue all year long. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, a judge ruled in New Mexico that the state wasn't doing enough to meet its constitutional requirements to provide an adequate education for students who are at risk. Can we talk a little bit about what that ruling did to really kind of get the ball moving in addressing the issue of child well-being and also early childhood education?
Well, I think that what was very specific about that ruling was that the judge is saying that New Mexico is not doing we have a bad rap as it is on educating our children in New Mexico. We're ranked perennially 49th or 50th in the United States on education. But what this ruling said was that in particular we're doing a bad job of educating low-income students, Native American students, English language learners, and children with special education.
Now, I was reading your reporting and you cited that 34% of students, of kids living in the state are from an economically, are living in poverty, basically.
Yes.
Now, another issue that was uncovered and is talked about more as we discuss child well-being in New Mexico is the CDC Kaiser study that you cited in your reporting from the late 1990s that really highlighted ACEs. Could you tell us a little bit about what ACEs is and how that impacts child well-being?
Yeah, I'm really happy that you asked that question because I think that ACEs is sort of having its moment, right? ACEs is adverse childhood experiences, and that study from the 1990s showed that people who as children had incidents like having a parent who was a drug user or an alcohol user, or who experienced child abuse, or who had a parent who was in jail, things like that can affect how their brain develops, which is a huge thing that will be impacting education. It affects their health as adults. It affects their ability to maintain a job. And so I think those are actually kind of intertwining because there's a lot of poverty, and poverty is one of those factors. So I think that more people are becoming aware of that. I think that there are people in the health system and in the education system that kind of know about that, but I think it's getting out more to the public, and I think the public needs to know about it. So even though they seem like two different things, like this ACEs, and children's exposure to ACEs is one thing, and our poor education system, they might seem different, but in many ways they affect each other.
And in your reporting, you talked about it. People that experience ACEs could be even more prone to substance abuse,
yes,
to behavioral health issues, and other
teen
at-risk
pregnancy and things like that. One thing that it sounds really sad, and it sounds like what do we even do about this? But the one thing that advocates say is that really one of the easiest ways, it's not a death sentence. You're not doomed to a terrible life because you have been exposed to ACEs. But one thing that does help is having an adult who you can turn to. And I think that so there are things that we can do to mitigate it. One thing is the educational system. There's an effort that has just started, and I've done some reporting on this here in Las Cruces, that is looking into how can we A, prevent ACEs, and B, mitigate the harm from these ACEs. And so that's being led by City Councilor Cassandra Gandara, with a whole bunch of people in the education and mental health and lawmaking community to really address this problem.
One thing that really struck me in your reporting was that as adults, we hear the saying a lot that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. You know, and we've often heard that, well, kids are resilient, or perhaps, you know, a lot of adversity is good for kids. But the mental health professionals that you spoke with are really saying the opposite. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, it's there's an interesting documentary that I watched that called Paper Tigers, and they're like, you have a fight or flight response. Everybody has a fight or flight response, and when there's something bad happens, you either try to flee from it or you fight. What's happening to a lot of these children is that they're, you know, it's pretty much as if the tiger is living in their home. Every day they're exposed to it. And that actually will affect their brain chemistry, and it'll affect how they react. Now, if somebody had you know, everybody's going to run into adversity. That's absolutely true. But if you have somebody who's there to comfort you, that helps you to deal with that is an insulating factor, and that helps you. But if you don't have that, that's where you really start to get into the problems. And it's been shown to really affect how children learn, how they deal with their emotions. And, you know, that brings problems that go into the classroom, and that makes it difficult for teachers to teach. And, you know, it has a lot of after effects, for sure.
But it also seems, you know, it's also difficult for people who are not involved with that or impacted by it, that they have to get over the stigma of it as well.
Yes, and you know what, that's a good point, because I think there is a tendency in New Mexico to say, well, this is a problem in all of our poor communities, right? And we do have a lot of poverty here, but, you know, ACEs is not confined to low-income neighborhoods. You know, drug abuse is not confined to low-income neighborhoods. In fact, some of the biggest drug turn-ins are on the East Mesa, which tends to have the reputation of being the nice part of town.
Here in Las Cruces.
Here in Las Cruces.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a thing. And a lot of times there is a problem of stigma where people don't want to talk about it, because this is something you keep to yourself. So I think that there's a lot of complicating factors in trying to address this and try to make things better.
Well, one of the ways lawmakers and educators have been trying to address this is by expanding resources for early childhood education. Now, you did some reporting about what is happening here in Las Cruces. Could you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so last year I did a story on this effort. It's being led by this nonprofit agency called Engage. They put together an early childhood coalition that's really working to improve it. And part of it was just, the very first thing was just figuring out, like, where are we here in Doña Ana County on early childhood education. And so they sort of did a baseline study of who's got coverage, who doesn't, you know. And so that was sort of their first step. And, you know, well, probably their first one was getting everybody together, which I think is a great thing. But so now they've kind of got a baseline, and they're looking at that. What's really positive is just recently Las Cruces Public School got its first New Mexico pre-K classes, and that's a really good step forward, because right now we've only had Head Start and New Mexico pre-K at private child care centers. So this is a really good step forward, I think. And that will really help, because there are studies showing that if you have New Mexico pre-K and you combine it with the expanded school year, it's called K3+, but it's essentially like another month of school, it erases that education gap between low-income students and regular students. And that is like a game changer for what, I mean, that could really help to solve some of the issues that were raised by the education lawsuit.
Real quick, I want to talk about Head Start. You mentioned that there may be, you know, this kind of stereotype that Head Start is not getting the right teachers with the right credentials, but you found quite the opposite in Las Cruces. In
Las Cruces, for sure. Now, I think that this is in Las Cruces, all of the Head Start teachers, at least at LCPS, need to have a bachelor's degree. That's a requirement. And because they're in Las Cruces, they have a better chance of doing that. They're also in the public schools, which means they get paid the same as a kindergarten teacher or a first grade teacher. And so if you look at that, they're making, what, $36,000 to $40,000 a year. At a private preschool, they're making in the 20s. So it's a lot tougher for them to attract teachers. So they have that advantage. And that kind of makes it possible for them to do a really high quality program, because they do show that the more educated a teacher is, the better the results are for students.
Now, from the second largest city in the state to the rural areas, you hit the road and traveled to the eastern part of the state. You went to Roswell. Could you share with us what they're doing there and how they're meeting the challenge of early childhood education there?
Sure. You know, somebody tipped me off to Roswell because they said, you know, there's just exciting things going on there. And I met a whole group of people that are just so passionate about putting together a really comprehensive plan. Like, they see, you know, they're a really isolated area. They're not that small. There are 48,000. There's 48,000 people in that community, which is fairly large for New Mexico. But like, there's a whole lot of nothing around it, and so it's really hard for them to get teachers. You know, so it's tough for them to find college-educated early childhood teachers. So they're like looking to grow their own teachers. They're like, we're starting up a teacher training school at the high school. So they're like, you know, we want our students to think about education as a future, because it's really tough for them to get somebody from out of the area to teach there.
So I mean, how are they able to fund this? Because that could also be a challenge for, you know, many rural districts, and to you know, meet the demands with the local funding and also the state funding and federal funding.
Yeah, so they're being really strategic about how they're putting money together, and they're probably a little further along even than Las Cruces Public Schools, because they've been looking at ways like, how do I take state money and federal money, put them in the same place so that I can offer more opportunities to our kids. And they've actually, the way they put it together, they're pretty close to an 80% preschool at their public school. We're nowhere near that here in Las Cruces. I think according to the Doña Ana County Coalition, it's maybe like 30-some%. So they're far ahead of us, and that's a pretty good record.
Wow. Now, you also went to the small community of Jow. Now, tell us a little bit about that. It's a old ranching community. Now it's a oil boom area.
Yeah, it's an oil boom. There's man camps all over that place. So it's really, and I was driving down there and it was like, what is this traffic? So there's a lot of energy in that community. There's a lot of stuff going on, but the one thing that they don't have is that they're still a pretty small population. And so as much as they had all this going on, there was not one preschool in the entire town.
Seemed like there was a challenge for early childhood education, licensed childhood education there.
Yeah, there was none at all. So nothing existed in that community. And you know, there's a lot of working folks there, and these people, they can't get any early childhood educators if it's so much easier to go work in the field. And so a lot of the teachers at Jow Elementary, and there's like, it's one school, one elementary and one junior, senior high school. I mean, it's a pretty small community. And they were like, they kept getting phone calls saying, hey, is there any place that I can take my kid? And you know, a teacher at the school was like driving 30 miles each way to drop her kids off at a child care center. So they just decided, you know what, we should just do this. And so they had no idea exactly how that was going to go, and they didn't know how they were going to do it, but they went to the state and asked, hey, can we do this? And the first response was like, no. But you know, pretty quickly they just had conversations, and they were like, well, they tried to figure out a way to make it happen, and they did do that. And so they immediately, like as soon as they opened the doors to their preschool, they were completely loaded. 50 students in the first year, and they're in their first year. They're just finishing their first year, so it has been an unqualified success. And this actually is a really good model, I think, for small communities across New Mexico, because it shows that something like this, A, works, and B, fulfills a need that these communities might not have.
But what about funding, though? I mean, how's that formula working for them? Now, I know we just have a little bit over a minute left, so if you can kind of share with us about that.
Well, you know, this is definitely a pilot type of thing. They're really trying it out because nothing like this has ever happened before. And what it is the Public Education Department and the Children, Youth, and Family Department essentially have funding that's mixed in this classroom, and they had to kind of make that work. And quite honestly, I don't know the secret sauce that they did that, but they did find a way. They found a way to make that happen.
Now, also, we don't have very much time, but now as you're able to, step away from this and, these stories develop, what are some of the things that you see that, educators and districts may try to do? Is this something that you think they're going to look at, like places like Jal and Roswell?
Well, I think that those are really good models for people to look. I think the one thing to do is to see, for communities to see, like, what are the individual or like what are the unique characteristics and things that we need to address, and then look at it as a whole. I think that that's the most successful. I think that's how they did in JAL. That's how they were looking at it in Roswell, and really how, they hope to look at it here in Las Cruces. One thing I would say at Las Cruces Public Schools, we were talking about ACEs earlier, and they're looking at a community school model that kind of, and that's something that I'm working on right now, is addressing a lot of these things in a holistic way inside the school, right where the kids are. So I think that keeping kids in mind and then kind of really looking big picture is a great way to approach education in early childhood in New Mexico.
Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno.
The United States has a rich history of movie making, and in the early days, of course, before television and even before radio, going to the movies was the only way that people could experience the outside world. So it was a very rich tradition and a very important part of daily life in the community. People had an opportunity to see what was going on in the rest of the world. Then it made things much more accessible to people. It's believed that the site itself was where Confederate and Union Army barracks were contained in the Civil War area. The oldest part of the building dates back to the late 1800s, and that's the front wall. But the theater itself was built in 1905. The history of the Fountain Theater actually starts with Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain, who moved here in the late 1800s and was a very prominent citizen in Mesilla, was an attorney, and he was involved in a lot of very controversial issues at the time. He had a lot of political enemies, and he was passing over the Organ Mountains, and he disappeared. They never found him or his son, Henry, who was traveling with him, and it's believed that he was murdered by some of his political enemies. His son, Albert Fountain Jr., built the theater in 1905 as a venue for the Fountain family to perform. So in the early days of the theater, it was a vaudeville theater music variety show. The Fountain family was a family of performers, and so the theater was actually built with them in mind. It was in 1912 that Albert Fountain started showing silent films in the Fountain Theater. And the subtitles were in English, but because the audience was Spanish speaking, he had to translate the English subtitles into Spanish. And he would actually inject little jokes or personal asides into the narrative to entertain the audiences. In 1914, Albert Fountain Jr., son of the original owner, began the murals. And through the teens and 20s, he worked on the murals until they were completed. But over the years, they have been touched up and refurbished due to damage and plaster falling, that sort of thing. Albert Fountain III started showing talkies. That began in around 1929, and until the early 1950s, that was what the theater showed. And then there was a period of time when the building was not used except for storage. It reopened again in the early 1960s with another descendant of Albert Fountain, who then presented more contemporary films to the community. It was in the early 60s also that the Las Cruces Community Theater started working here. The owner of the theater at the time, Arthur Fountain, leased it to the Las Cruces Community Theater, making the theater accessible to NMSU theater department as well as using it as a venue for films. So that was quite an opportunity for people in the community and for people at NMSU because it provided a venue for experience outside the university setting where the public could come and see their performances.
We loved it here, and it was old, and it was historic, and it was important to have these murals on the side, the stage here. But the most important thing about this place was how at that particular time and energy, the people that connected to it were extremely gifted in the arts. And we didn't do fluff. This was where Mark Menoff got his opportunity to do a lot of his original plays, and he directed, and we were boundless. We had energy galore, and we were fearless is what we were. This was one of my favorite, the effect of gamma rays in the Men Miracles. I was 25 when I did this play, but I was playing a 14-year-old. I remember when I was rehearsing, my hand was shaking, but of course opening night is you walk on stage and it's magic.
As far as the theater goes, this year and probably next year, some additional changes will be made, including new theater seats and new cafe seating in the back part of the theater. I think for many years to come, the Fountain Theater will be standing and will continue to thrive in the community as a venue for the arts, which is a fantastic opportunity for people in the community and visitors who come from outlying areas.
That is one beautiful theater. Well, that is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition, 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org. We'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.